In the heart of downtown Manhattan, a 20-year-old black mechanic was about to make a decision that would cost him everything he'd worked for. But what happened next would prove that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to find yourself. Before we dive into this incredible true story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the oil-stained concrete of Patterson's Auto Service on East 47th Street. The familiar symphony of impact wrenches, air compressors, and classic rock radio filled the cavernous garage as another Tuesday began like countless others. But for Malik Thompson, this Tuesday would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and the price of standing up for what's right. At just 20 years old, Malik had already earned a reputation as one of the sharpest mechanics in the shop. His lean frame moved with practiced efficiency beneath the hood of a silver BMW, dark hand steady as he diagnosed a complex transmission issue that had stumped 3 other technicians. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill, his navy coveralls bearing the honest stains of hard work and dedication. His fingers traced the transmission lines with the precision of a surgeon, feeling for the subtle vibrations that would reveal the source of the problem. This particular BMW had been cycling through the shop for 3 days, with seasoned mechanics throwing up their hands in frustration. But Malik had a gift, an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that went beyond textbook knowledge. "Found it," he murmured to himself, identifying a hairline crack in the torque converter that the previous diagnostics had missed. It was the kind of detail that separated good mechanics from great ones, the ability to see what others overlooked. But respect? That was harder to come by. "Yo, rookie." Danny Sullivan's voice cut through the garage noise like a rusty blade. "Boss wants that Beamer done by noon, not midnight. Pick up the pace." Malik didn't look up from his work, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. At 26, Danny had only been at Patterson 6 months longer than Malik, but he wielded those extra months like a crown. The casual racism wrapped in workplace banter had become as routine as the morning coffee run, small cuts that left invisible scars. Danny was the kind of guy who'd peaked in high school and spent every day since trying to reclaim that brief moment of relevance. He'd played junior varsity football for a team that never made playoffs, worked construction for 3 years before a back injury forced him into automotive repair, and carried a chip on his shoulder that made him lash out at anyone he perceived as threatening his tenuous position in the shop hierarchy. "Almost done," Malik replied evenly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who'd learned early that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. From across the bay, Tommy Chun snorted with amusement. "Kid's got patience, I'll give him that. Where I come from, guys like him usually got anger issues." Tommy was second-generation Korean American, his father having built a successful dry cleaning business through decades of 16-hour days and systematic discrimination. But instead of learning empathy from his family's struggles, Tommy had somehow concluded that assimilation meant adopting the prejudices of those who'd once excluded his own people. The comment drew chuckles from the small crowd of mechanics gathered around the coffee machine. Malik's wrench slipped slightly, scraping his knuckle against the transmission housing. A thin line of blood appeared, but he simply wiped it on his coveralls and continued working. This was his reality, brilliant with his hands, invisible as a human being. The garage operated on an ecosystem of casual cruelty that had been refined over decades. Every joke was a test, every comment a way of establishing pecking order. The veterans maintained their status by keeping the newcomers in line, and the newcomers eventually became veterans by proving they could dish out the same treatment they'd once received. But Malik had never quite fit into this cycle. He was too talented to ignore, too principled to participate, too proud to break. This combination made him simultaneously valuable and dangerous to the existing order, a walking contradiction that forced everyone around him to confront their own compromises. For Malik, this job wasn't just a paycheck. It was everything. His mother, Janet Thompson, worked double shifts as a nursing assistant at Mount Sinai Hospital, her body wearing down after 15 years of lifting patients and swallowing the same casual disrespect her son faced daily. Their small apartment in Harlem depended on both their incomes, and Malik's dreams stretched far beyond just paying rent. Janet Thompson was a woman who'd raised her son with stories of her grandfather, who'd been a sharecropper in Alabama before moving north during the Great Migration. He'd worked in steel mills and auto plants, his hands permanently stained with industrial grease, his back bent from decades of labor that built other people's fortunes while leaving his own family perpetually on the edge of poverty. "Your great-grandfather used to tell me," Janet would say during their quiet Sunday mornings, "that every honest day's work was a prayer, even when the people you work for didn't see your humanity. But he also taught me that there's a difference between dignity and doormat. You can keep your head up without keeping your mouth shut." Those words had shaped Malik's approach to everything. He worked harder than anyone else in the shop, staying late to perfect repairs that others would have called good enough. He studied automotive technology in his spare time, reading technical manuals the way other young men his age consume video games or social media. Every certification he earned, every complex diagnosis he solved, every impossible repair he completed was a step toward the future he was building in his mind. He wanted his own shop someday, a place where skill mattered more than skin color, where a young black man with calloused hands and a sharp mind could build something lasting. In his vision, it would be more than just a business. It would be a community institution, hiring kids from the neighborhood who needed a chance, training the next generation of mechanics who understood that excellence and integrity weren't mutually exclusive. Every insult he swallowed, every joke he ignored, every time he bit his tongue when Danny or Tommy made their comments, it was all supposed to be temporary. Investment in a future that felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant. The apartment in Harlem, where Malik lived with his mother, was a testament to their careful budgeting and shared sacrifices. The two-bedroom unit on the fourth floor of a pre-war building had thin walls, inconsistent heat, and plumbing that required constant attention. But it was theirs, and Janet had made it into a home through sheer force of will and creativity. The living room walls were covered with Malik's automotive certificates and his mother's nursing credentials, creating a gallery of achievement that told the story of two people who refused to let circumstances define their potential. On the small dining table that doubled as Malik's study space, technical manuals sat alongside his mother's medical journals, their shared commitment to professional excellence evident in every carefully highlighted page. But the financial reality was unforgiving. Janet's arthritis was worsening, making her physically demanding job increasingly difficult. At 52, she was already talking about the impossibility of working until retirement, her body wearing out faster than her savings could grow. Malik's income from Patterson's Waza garage was what kept them stable, what allowed his mother to afford the prescription medications that kept her mobile, what made the difference between surviving and thriving. The pressure was constant, but unspoken. Every morning, when Malik left for work, he carried the weight of his family's security on his shoulders. Every evening when he returned home, he saw the exhaustion in his mother's eyes and knew that his success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about providing the life his mother had sacrificed everything to make possible. The garage operated on an unspoken hierarchy that had nothing to do with talent. At the top sat Frank Patterson, the 60-year-old owner who'd inherited the business from his father and rarely descended from his glass-walled office unless there was serious money involved. Patterson was a ghost in his own shop, appearing only for major customer complaints or quarterly reviews, his primary contribution being the kind of benign neglect that allowed toxic cultures to flourish unchecked. Below him, Mike Reynolds ruled the floor, a thick-necked manager in his 40s who'd turned workplace intimidation into an art form. Reynolds had started as a mechanic himself 20 years earlier, but a combination of political savvy and willingness to enforce unpopular decisions had elevated him to management. He understood that his position depended on keeping the workforce divided and competitive, using favoritism and fear to maintain control. Reynolds had made it clear from Malik's first day that exceptional performance was expected, not rewarded. "You're here to work, not to make friends or prove points," he'd said during the hiring interview, his eyes scanning Malik's resume with barely concealed skepticism. "Keep your head down, do the job, and maybe you'll last longer than the last kid we had in here." The last kid had been Jerome Williams, another young black mechanic who'd quit after 6 months of similar treatment. His toolbox had sat empty for 3 weeks before Malik filled it, and sometimes he wondered if he was destined for the same inevitable exit. Jerome's departure had been sudden and bitter, prompted by an incident involving a customer complaint that everyone knew had been fabricated by Danny Sullivan to get Jerome in trouble. "They set me up," Jerome had told Malik during a chance encounter at a subway station months later. "Customer said I scratched his car, even though I had photos proving the scratch was there when he brought it in. But Reynolds took the customer's side, docked my pay, wrote me up. I couldn't take it anymore." Jerome's story haunted Malik because it revealed the precarious nature of his own position. Excellence wasn't enough if someone wanted you gone. Integrity wasn't protection if the system itself was corrupt. The only thing that mattered was fitting into the cultural expectations of the shop, and those expectations seemed designed to exclude people who looked like him. But quitting wasn't an option. Not with his mother's arthritis getting worse. Not with the dreams that kept him working past closing time, perfecting his craft on his own dime. Every transmission he rebuilt, every engine he diagnosed, every impossible repair he completed was a step toward the future he was building in his mind. The financial mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Malik's take-home pay of $2,100 per month covered his share of rent, utilities, groceries, and transportation, leaving little room for savings or unexpected expenses. His mother's income from the hospital was slightly higher, but her medical costs consumed most of the difference. Together, they lived paycheck to paycheck with the kind of careful planning that made every dollar count. Malik had calculated that he needed at least 3 years of steady employment at Patterson's to save enough money for a down payment on his own shop. 3 years of swallowing pride, ignoring insults, and proving himself daily to people who'd already decided he didn't belong. It was a prison sentence disguised as an opportunity, but it was the only path he could see toward the future he wanted. The morning crawled forward with its usual rhythm of casual cruelty and grinding labor. Malik finished the BMW ahead of schedule, earning nothing more than a grunt of acknowledgement from Reynolds. He moved on to a Honda Civic with a mysterious electrical issue, losing himself in the methodical process of tracing circuits and testing connections. This particular Honda belonged to Maria Santos, a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to support her 3 children. She couldn't afford to be without her car for more than a day, and the previous shop had quoted her $1,200 for repairs she couldn't afford. Malik had spent his lunch break the previous day diagnosing the real problem, a $30 relay that any competent mechanic should have identified in 10 minutes. But competence wasn't always the goal at Patterson's. Some mechanics preferred expensive repairs because they generated higher labor charges, and customers like Maria were seen as easy targets for overcharging. Malik had quietly fixed her car for the quoted $30, earning a tearful hug of gratitude that meant more to him than any official recognition. It was during this focused work that the garage door chimed, announcing another customer. Malik glanced up briefly, noting a large man in worn leather stepping through the entrance. The stranger's appearance immediately shifted the room's energy. Conversations paused, eyes tracked his movement, bodies subtly angled away from him. The man wore a leather jacket that had seen years of weather and wear, dark jeans, and heavy boots that announced each step on the concrete floor. Intricate tattoos crept up his neck like dark vines, and the patches on his jacket left no doubt about his affiliation. Hell's Angels was stitched in bold letters across his back, while smaller patches decorated the front. Earned markers in a world most people only knew through movies and fear. But it wasn't his appearance that caught Malik's attention. It was his expression. The man's face was flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow. His eyes darted frantically around the garage, searching for help with the desperate intensity of someone running out of time. This wasn't swagger or intimidation. This was panic, raw and unfiltered. The contrast was jarring. A man whose appearance projected danger and authority, reduced to vulnerability by circumstances beyond his control. Malik recognized that look because he'd seen it in his own mirror during his mother's worst health scares. The helpless desperation of someone watching the most important thing in their world slip away. He approached the front counter where Sandra Kim sat filing her nails with practiced disinterest. Sandra was a woman in her 30s who'd perfected the art of looking busy while accomplishing nothing, her long acrylic nails clicking against her phone screen as she scrolled through social media during work hours. She'd been at Patterson's for 8 years, protected from firing by her willingness to cover for Reynolds' various indiscretions and her complete lack of ambition to rise above her current position. "Excuse me," the biker said, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "My bike died just outside. I need help. My daughter's in the emergency room at Presbyterian. She was in an accident. I need to get there now." Sandra's expression didn't change. She continued scrolling, her gums snapping between words like punctuation marks of indifference. "You'll need to fill out a work order. Take a seat, and someone will get to you when they can." The dismissal was casual and absolute, delivered without even the courtesy of eye contact. Sandra had perfected the bureaucratic response that turned human emergencies into procedural obstacles, her tone suggesting that the biker's crisis was an inconvenience to her routine. "Listen, I don't have time for paperwork," the man pressed, leaning forward slightly. His voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with fear. "She's in surgery. I just need a jump start, or whatever it takes to get the bike running. I'll pay whatever you want." Now, Sandra looked up, her eyes scanning the man's appearance with undisguised distaste. The tattoos, the leather, the patches, all of it registered as threat assessment rather than human recognition. "Sir, we have a process here. Everyone waits their turn." Behind the biker, other customers began shifting uncomfortably. A well-dressed woman, clutching a designer purse, moved closer to her husband, whispering something that made him glance toward the exit. Their body language spoke of people preparing to flee, as if the biker's presence had transformed the garage from safe space to potential crime scene. An elderly man in a cardigan simply stood and walked out, shaking his head as he passed. His departure was pointed and deliberate, a silent protest against having to share space with someone who looked so different from himself. "Should call the cops," someone muttered from the waiting area. "Guys like that are usually running from something." The comment hung in the air like smoke, transforming the biker from customer to suspect without any evidence beyond appearance. It was the kind of casual prejudice that Malik knew intimately, the immediate assumption of guilt based on nothing more than failing to conform to middle-class expectations of respectability. The biker turned slightly, registering the fear and judgment surrounding him. His shoulders sagged as the weight of everyone's assumptions settled on him like a physical burden. He stepped back from the counter, running a shaking hand through his graying hair. "Look, I understand how this looks," he said to the room in general, his voice quieter now. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to get to my little girl." But the damage was done. The invisible barriers had been erected, and no amount of explanation could tear them down. The man pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he started to dial what was probably a cab company. In that moment, he looked exactly like what he was, a terrified father watching precious minutes tick away while bureaucracy and prejudice conspired to keep him from his daughter's bedside. That's when Malik set down his diagnostic tool and stood up. "What kind of bike?" Malik's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The biker looked up, surprise replacing desperation on his weathered face. In a room full of people who had already written him off, here was someone actually asking questions instead of making assumptions. "It's a Yamaha Cruiser," the man replied, hope creeping into his voice for the first time since he'd entered the shop. "Something's wrong with the ignition system. Won't turn over at all." Malik wiped his hands on a shop rag, already moving toward the front of the garage. The decision felt automatic, inevitable, like stepping forward to catch something that was falling. "Mind if I take a look? Might be something simple." The offer hung in the air for a moment, charged with significance that everyone in the room could feel. This wasn't just about fixing a motorcycle. This was about choosing sides in a battle that had been raging long before any of them had walked through those doors. Danny Sullivan's voice carried from across the shop, loud enough to ensure everyone heard it. "Look who's playing hero again. Malik's gonna save the day." The mockery was immediate and predictable, but Malik had expected it. He'd learned long ago that doing the right thing in the wrong environment would always draw criticism from people who'd made their peace with compromise. Tommy Chin joined in with a theatrical whisper that carried clearly across the garage. "Hope he knows what he's getting into. Guy looks like bad news." But Malik was already grabbing his portable toolbox, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He'd made his choice, and second-guessing would only waste the time this man didn't have. "You don't have to," the biker started, but Malik was already heading toward the door. "No problem. What's your name?" "Ray. Ray Henderson. I'm Malik. Let's see what's going on with your ride." As they walked toward the exit together, the garage erupted in whispers and pointed looks. The other customers watched with a mixture of fascination and horror, as if they were witnessing something scandalous. The mechanics continued their commentary, their voices carrying the particular cruelty of people who felt safe in their numbers. "Kid doesn't know when to mind his own business," someone muttered. "Probably thinks he's going to make friends with the angels," another voice added, followed by nervous laughter. But Malik ignored the commentary, focusing instead on the sleek black Yamaha parked at the curb. The bike was older but well-maintained, its chrome still gleaming despite years of use. Even under stress, Ray had taken care of his machine, a sign of character that spoke to Malik's mechanic instincts. "How long has she been acting up?" Malik asked, already reaching for his multimeter. "Started this morning," Ray replied, hovering close but giving Malik room to work. "Never had trouble before. She's been reliable for 8 years." Malik nodded, connecting his diagnostic equipment to the bike's electrical system. Numbers flashed on the small screen as he traced the power flow from the battery through the ignition circuits. His hands moved with practiced confidence, following a mental checklist that had become second nature through years of experience. The problem revealed itself within minutes: a corroded connection in the starter relay that was preventing proper current flow. It was exactly the kind of issue that looked catastrophic to the owner, but could be fixed quickly by someone who knew what to look for. "Found it," Malik announced, holding up a small component blackened with corrosion. "Your starter relay's shot. Lucky for you, it's an easy fix." Ray's face lit up with hope for the first time since entering the garage. "How long will it take?" "Give me 10 minutes. As Malik worked, Ray stood guard beside him, both men acutely aware of the stares coming from inside the garage. The biker's presence had transformed Malik from invisible mechanic to rebellious troublemaker in the span of a single conversation. Through the garage windows, they could see heads turning, conversations pausing, fingers pointing. The mechanics had abandoned any pretense of work, gathering in small clusters to observe and comment on the unprecedented scene of someone actually helping the tattooed stranger. "You don't have to do this, kid," Ray said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd experienced a lifetime of similar situations. "I can see what's happening in there. Don't want you catching heat because of me." Malik looked up from his work, meeting Ray's eyes directly. There was something in that moment, a recognition that passed between them, the understanding shared by people who'd both been judged by their appearances rather than their character. "My name's Malik, not Kid," he replied, his voice steady and sure. "And I'm doing this because it's right, not because it's easy." Ray nodded slowly, recognizing the steel beneath Malik's calm exterior. He'd seen that same quality in other people who'd faced discrimination and chosen dignity over defeat. It was the look of someone who decided that preserving their integrity mattered more than preserving their comfort. Malik's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the corroded connections and installing a new relay from his emergency kit. The work was routine, but the context made it revolutionary. A young black man helping a Hell's Angel while their respective communities watched with suspicion and disapproval. "Where's your daughter now?" Malik asked as he worked, making conversation to help Ray stay calm. "Presbyterian Hospital," Ray replied, his voice tight with worry. "She was riding with some friends, and they hit a patch of ice. She went over the handlebars, hit her head pretty bad. They had to do emergency surgery to relieve the pressure." The details painted a picture that had nothing to do with the stereotypes surrounding motorcycle culture. This was a father terrified for his child, willing to humble himself before strangers if it meant getting to her bedside faster. "How old is she?" Malik continued, testing the electrical connections to ensure they were secure. 22. Just finished college, was going to start graduate school in the fall. Ray's voice cracked slightly. "She's the best thing I ever did with my life." The admission hung in the air between them, revealing the depth of love and fear that had driven Ray to seek help from people who clearly didn't want to provide it. In that moment, all the surface differences between them faded away, leaving only the universal experience of caring about someone more than yourself. The electrical flow restored, Malik reassembled the ignition system with the same careful attention he brought to every repair. This wasn't just about fixing a bike. It was about giving a father the chance to be where he needed to be when it mattered most. "Try it now," Malik said, stepping back and gesturing toward the ignition. Ray climbed onto the bike and turned the key. The Yamaha roared to life on the first attempt, its engine settling into the smooth, powerful idle of a well-maintained machine. Beautiful, Ray breathed, genuine gratitude flooding his voice. What do I owe you? Nothing, Malik replied, already packing his tools. Just get to your daughter. Ray reached for his wallet, but Malik waved him off with a gesture that had become automatic through years of helping neighbors and friends without expectation of payment. Seriously, man, family comes first. It was at that moment that Mike Reynolds emerged from the garage, his face thunderous with rage. The manager's heavy footsteps announced his approach long before his voice cut through the morning air, each step deliberate and menacing. Reynolds had been watching the entire interaction from his office window, his anger building with each passing minute. In his worldview, Malik's actions represented a direct challenge to his authority and the shop's unspoken rules about who deserved help and who didn't. What the hell is going on out here? Malik straightened, meeting Reynolds' glare with calm defiance that had been building for 2 years of accumulated slights and swallowed pride. Just helping a customer. Customer? Reynolds' laugh was harsh and mocking, designed to humiliate and intimidate. I don't see any work order. I don't see any payment. What I see is you wasting company time and resources on some random guy who wandered in off the street. The contempt in Reynolds' voice was unmistakable. Every word was calculated to reduce both Malik and Ray to their supposed proper places in his mental hierarchy, the insubordinate employee and the unwelcome intruder. Ray stepped forward, his hands raised peacefully. Despite his intimidating appearance, his body language was respectful, non-threatening. Look, I offer to pay. Malik wouldn't take anything. He just wanted to help. Reynolds' attention swung to Ray like a weapon being aimed, his prejudices crystallizing into open hostility. And who exactly are you to tell me how my shop operates? You think that leather jacket gives you some kind of authority here? The question dripped with the kind of class-based prejudice that saw motorcycle leathers and tattoos and immediately assumed criminality. In Reynolds' world, people like Ray were automatically threatening, automatically unwelcome, automatically deserving of suspicion rather than service. I'm just a father trying to get to his daughter, Ray replied quietly, his voice carrying the dignity of someone who'd learned not to let others' prejudices diminish his sense of self-worth. Nothing more, nothing less. Sure you are, Reynolds sneered, his disbelief obvious and insulting. Malik, get back inside. Now. The command was delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance, the tone of a man accustomed to having his authority go unquestioned. But Malik felt something crystallizing inside him. 2 years of accumulated frustration and suppressed anger finally finding focus. He wasn't hurting anyone, Malik said, his voice carrying across the street with newfound authority. His daughter's in the hospital. Reynolds stepped closer, his face darkening with the kind of rage that comes from having authority challenged in public. I don't care if his daughter's on Mars. We have protocols here. We don't work on vehicles without proper authorization. You know this. Protocols. Malik's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm that everyone present could hear. Or prejudice. The word hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or take back. Around them, the morning traffic continued its endless flow, but in that small space outside Patterson's auto service, time seemed suspended. The confrontation had moved beyond workplace discipline into something much more fundamental, a challenge to the assumptions and biases that governed how people treated each other. Reynolds took another step closer to Malik, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried the weight of institutional power and personal malice. You want to repeat that, boy? The racial undertone in boy wasn't lost on anyone present. It was a word designed to reduce, to diminish, to remind Malik of his place in Reynolds' carefully constructed hierarchy. But instead of shrinking from it, Malik felt something ignite inside him. A refusal to accept the diminishment that had defined his experience at Patterson's. I said what I said, Malik replied, his voice carrying across the street with the clarity of someone who'd finally decided to speak their truth regardless of consequences. This man needed help, and I gave it to him. That's not about protocols. That's about being human. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Reynolds' face flushed red with fury, his hands clenching in a fist at his sides as he struggled with the humiliation of being publicly challenged by someone he considered beneath him. "Pack your tools," Reynolds snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "You're done here." The words hit like physical blows, but Malik found himself nodding calmly, a strange sense of peace settling over him. "Yeah, I am." Ray stepped forward, his face etched with concern and guilt. "Wait, this is my fault. Don't fire him because of me. This isn't about you," Reynolds snapped, though his eyes never left Malik's face. "This is about an employee who thinks he can ignore direct orders and disrespect his supervisor." But Malik was already walking toward the garage entrance, his movements deliberate and unhurried. At the doorway, he paused and turned back to face Reynolds, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "The only disrespect I see here is how you treated a man whose only crime was asking for help." With that, he disappeared inside to collect his belongings, leaving Reynolds and Ray standing beside the still-running motorcycle. The manager's breathing was heavy, his fists clenched at his sides as he struggled with the humiliation of being publicly challenged and morally defeated by someone half his age. Ray watched the garage entrance for a long moment, then turned to Reynolds with a look that mixed disappointment with something harder to define. "That's a good kid in there. You just lost someone special, and need to get off my property," Reynolds replied coldly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Before I call the police." Ray didn't argue. He simply climbed onto his motorcycle, revved the engine once in acknowledgement of Malik's work, and pulled into traffic. But as he disappeared into the flow of Manhattan morning rush hour, he was already making mental notes and plans that would soon change everything. Inside the garage, Malik moved through the familiar motions of gathering his personal tools with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions while processing a life-changing event. His hands were steady as he packed wrenches and diagnostic equipment, but his mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. 2 years of careful progress, wiped away in a single morning because he'd chosen compassion over compliance. 2 years of swallowed pride, ignored insults, and strategic silence, all rendered meaningless by one moment of refusing to look the other way when someone needed help. The other mechanics watched from a distance, their expressions ranging from sympathy to schadenfreude to simple relief that they weren't the ones facing unemployment. Danny Sullivan made no effort to hide his satisfaction, leaning against a workbench with a smirk that suggested he was already calculating how Malik's departure would benefit his own position. Tommy Chun simply shook his head as if Malik had confirmed every stereotype he'd ever held about young black men, being too emotional, too impulsive, too unable to understand how the world really worked. But it was the silence that hurt most. Not one of his co-workers offered support or questioned Reynolds' decision. They simply watched him pack his life into cardboard boxes, their complicity as damning as any act of participation in his dismissal. Jonas Rivera, a quiet mechanic who'd started at Patterson's just 3 months earlier, appeared at Malik's workstation as he was removing his personal tools from the communal toolbox. Jonas was young, maybe 19, with the soft features and uncertain manner of someone still figuring out how to navigate workplace politics. "This is messed up," Jonas said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "You were just trying to help the guy." Malik looked up from his packing, studying Jonas's face. The younger man seemed genuinely troubled by what he'd witnessed, his sense of right and wrong still intact despite the corrupting influence of the garage culture. "Yeah, well," Malik replied, folding his coveralls and placing them in the cardboard box. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you expect to pay." Jonas shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say more, but uncertain about the wisdom of aligning himself with someone who'd just been fired for insubordination. "What are you going to do now?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond simple curiosity. Jonas was really asking whether challenging the system was worth the price, whether integrity had any practical value in a world that seemed to reward compliance over conscience. Malik stood up, hefting the box of tools that represented years of careful accumulation and professional development. "I'm going to figure it out. Always do." As he carried his belongings toward the exit, Sandra Kim looked up from her phone long enough to ask, "You want me to call you a cab?" The question carried no genuine concern, just the mechanical politeness of someone going through social motions without emotional investment. Sandra had watched the entire confrontation unfold without once considering whether Reynolds might be wrong, whether Malik might deserve support, whether her own silence made her complicit in the injustice. "I'll walk," Malik replied, adjusting his grip on the heavy toolbox. The morning air hit his face like a physical reminder of the choice he'd made, carrying equal measures of freedom and terror. He was 20 years old, unemployed, and carrying everything he owned in 2 cardboard boxes and a leather tool bag. The rational part of his mind screamed that he'd made a catastrophic mistake, that his mother would be devastated, that finding another job with his limited experience and inevitable bad reference would be nearly impossible. But there was another voice, quieter but stronger, that whispered a different truth. For the first time in 2 years, he felt like himself. 3 days passed in a blur of job applications and growing anxiety. Malik had sent his resume to every auto shop within a 20-mile radius of Manhattan, but the responses had been uniformly disappointing. Most didn't bother replying at all, while others offered positions so far below his skill level that they felt like insults wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. The few shops that did respond favorably inevitably asked for references from previous employers. When Malik mentioned Patterson's, the conversations grew noticeably cooler, often ending with promises to get back to you that never materialized. Reynolds was clearly poisoning his chances, describing him as insubordinate, unreliable, and potentially dangerous, words that would follow him like shadows, making each application an exercise in futility. His mother had taken the news of his firing with characteristic stoicism, but Malik could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. Janet Thompson had raised her son to stand up for what was right, but she also understood the brutal mathematics of survival in a world that rarely rewarded principle over pragmatism. "Something will work out," she assured him over their meager dinner of canned soup and day-old bread purchased from the discount rack at their local grocery store. "You're too talented to stay unemployed for long." But the reassurance fell hollow in the face of their dwindling bank account and the stack of bills that continued arriving with clockwork regularity. Malik had calculated that they could survive for maybe 6 weeks on their combined savings before having to make impossible choices about rent, food, and his mother's medications. The apartment seemed smaller during those 3 days of unemployment, its walls closing in as the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. Every sound from the neighboring units seemed amplified: crying babies, arguing couples, the constant hum of televisions playing shows he couldn't afford the cable to watch. Malik spent his days walking the streets of Manhattan, visiting auto shops in person with copies of his resume and a practiced smile that grew more strained with each rejection. The pattern was always the same: initial interest based on his obvious knowledge and experience, followed by cooling enthusiasm once they called Patterson's for a reference. By the 3rd day, he was considering jobs in New Jersey, in Connecticut, anywhere far enough from Patterson's influence that Reynolds' poison couldn't reach. But the transportation costs alone would eat up most of any potential salary, and leaving his mother alone in Harlem while she struggled with her worsening arthritis felt like abandonment. It was during this dark period that the knock came at their apartment door. The sound was firm, but not aggressive, the kind of knock that announced serious business without threat. Malik opened it to find Ray Henderson standing in the narrow hallway. But this was a different Ray than the desperate father he'd met at the garage. This man wore a tailored charcoal business suit that fit his broad frame perfectly, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Malik made in a month, and a confidence that spoke of boardrooms and executive decisions. His graying hair was neatly styled, his manner professional but warm. The transformation was so complete that for a moment, Malik wondered if he was looking at the same person. "Hello, Malik," Ray said with a slight smile that carried genuine warmth. "Mind if I come in? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Confused but curious, Malik invited him inside, his mind racing with questions about how Ray had found their address, why he was here, and what the expensive suit meant in the context of everything that had happened. His mother emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. Janet Thompson moved carefully, her arthritis making each step deliberate, but her nurse's intuition was immediately assessing this unexpected visitor. Despite his transformed appearance, something about Ray's demeanor put her at ease. The way he waited to be invited to sit, the respect in his voice when he spoke, the genuine concern in his eyes. Ray introduced himself with old-fashioned courtesy, shaking Janet's hand gently and asking about her health with the kind of attention that suggested genuine interest rather than polite formality. "Mrs. Thompson, I owe your son a debt I can never fully repay," Ray explained as they settled in the small living room. "Because of his kindness, I made it to the hospital in time to be with my daughter before her surgery. The doctors weren't sure she'd make it, but she did. She's going to be fine." Janet's eyes welled with tears, her hand reaching for Malik's as maternal pride mixed with relief for a stranger's child. "Oh, thank goodness. How wonderful that she's recovered." Ray nodded, his own emotion evident as he spoke about those terrifying hours in the hospital waiting room. "But there's something else you both should know. Something that might change how you see what happened at that garage." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, extracting several official-looking documents that he placed carefully on a coffee table. The letterhead was impressive: Henderson Automotive Group, with an address on Park Avenue that spoke of serious corporate presence. "My full name is Raymond Henderson," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "I'm the CEO and majority owner of Henderson Automotive Group. We operate 47 service centers across the tri-state area, including Patterson's Auto Service." The words hit Malik like a physical blow, the room spinning slightly as the implications crashed over him in waves. The biker, the Hell's Angel who'd been dismissed and humiliated at the garage, was actually the owner of the entire company. The man whose bike he'd fixed for free controlled the business empire that included the shop where he'd just been fired. "I started this business 35 years ago with nothing but a toolbox and a dream," Ray explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd built something significant from nothing. "Back then, I looked a lot different than I do today. Clean-cut, conservative clothes, pressed shirts, the whole corporate uniform. But success has afforded me certain freedoms, including the freedom to be myself." He gestured to the tattoos visible beneath his dress shirt sleeves, intricate artwork that told stories of friendship, loss, and personal meaning. "These aren't gang markings or symbols of rebellion. They're memorials to friends I've lost over the years, reminders of where I came from, artwork that tells my story. Each one represents something important. My first business partner who died in a motorcycle accident, my father who taught me everything about engines, the neighborhood where I grew up." Janet was listening with the fascination of someone hearing a story that challenged every assumption she'd made about appearances and identity. "The motorcycle club?" Ray smiled, understanding her question. "The Hells Angels aren't about crime or violence, despite what movies and television might suggest. For me, it's about brotherhood, about men who understand what it means to work with your hands and earn respect through action, not appearance. It's about loyalty, about having people who'll be there when everything else falls apart." He leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "But most importantly, it's about remembering where you came from even after you've achieved success. I could have easily driven to that garage in a Mercedes, wearing a $3,000 suit, and received immediate, obsequious service. But that wouldn't have told me anything about the character of the people working there." Janet was beginning to understand. "You were testing them." Ray shook his head firmly. "Not testing, just being myself and seeing how people would react. In business, I've learned that you can tell everything about a person's character by how they treat someone they perceive as having no power over them." The truth of that statement hung in the air, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the automotive industry. It was a philosophy that could be applied to any workplace, any social situation, any moment when someone had to choose between compassion and convenience. Ray turned his attention back to Malik, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Your coworkers saw a stereotype and responded with prejudice and fear. Your manager saw a threat to his authority and responded with aggression and discrimination. But you saw a human being in distress and responded with compassion and competence." Malik found his voice at last, still struggling to process the magnitude of what he was learning. "I had no idea who you were." "Exactly." Ray's smile widened. "That's what makes your actions so remarkable. You didn't help me because you thought it would benefit you, or because you were trying to impress someone important. You helped me because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of character I want representing my company." Ray opened his portfolio and slid a contract across the coffee table toward Malik, the documents thick with legal language and official seals. I'm offering you a position as regional manager for our flagship location in Queens. You'll supervise a team of 15 technicians, with full authority to hire and fire based on merit and character alone. The salary is $68,000 annually, plus health benefits, profit sharing, company car, and a clear path to franchise ownership within 5 years. Malik stared at the contract, the numbers swimming before his eyes as his mind struggled to process what was happening. It was more money than he dreamed of making before his 30th birthday, with opportunities that stretched far beyond anything he'd imagined possible just a week earlier. The salary alone was more than triple what Patterson had been paying him, enough to move his mother to a better apartment, to ensure she could afford her medications without worry, to begin building the kind of financial security that had always seemed impossibly distant. There are conditions, Ray continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. I want you to implement a company-wide training program on unconscious bias and workplace respect. Too many of our locations operate like Patterson's. Good work getting done by people who've forgotten that excellence comes from inclusion, not exclusion. I want you to develop a system for identifying and promoting talent regardless of background. And I want you to serve as a mentor for young mechanics who might otherwise be overlooked by the industry. Janet reached over and squeezed her son's hand, her eyes bright with tears of pride and relief. The transformation in their circumstances was so dramatic, so sudden, that it felt almost unreal. What about Patterson's? Malik asked, his voice steady despite the emotional storm inside him. Ray's expression hardened slightly. Mike Reynolds has been terminated, effective immediately. We don't tolerate discrimination in any form, and his behavior toward both of us was unacceptable. The other mechanics at Patterson's will be retrained or replaced, depending on their willingness to embrace a more inclusive workplace culture. The news hit Malik with complicated emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing that Reynolds would face consequences for his actions, but also a deeper understanding that individual punishment wouldn't solve the systemic problems that had made such behavior possible in the first place. Frank Patterson is also being removed as site manager, Ray continued. He'll retain partial ownership, but no operational control. The shop will be run according to company standards from now on, with zero tolerance for the kind of toxic culture that drove you away. Malik looked at the contract again, his mind racing through the implications of accepting such a dramatic change in his life trajectory. This is incredible, but I have to ask, why me? You could hire someone with more management experience, someone who's already proven themselves in a leadership role. Ray leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Experience can be taught. Character can't. I've been in business for 35 years, and I've learned that the best leaders aren't the ones who start at the top. They're the ones who work their way up while maintaining their integrity, who understand what it's like to be underestimated and overlooked. He gestured toward the contract. You've already shown me that you'll stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. That's not just moral courage, that's leadership. I can teach you the business side, the management techniques, the corporate procedures. But I can't teach someone to see a human being in distress and choose compassion over convenience. Janet spoke up, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades navigating workplace politics while maintaining her own integrity. What do you think, baby? Malik looked from his mother to Ray, then back to the contract that represented everything he'd worked toward and more than he'd ever dared hope for. The numbers were staggering, the opportunities unprecedented, but what struck him most was the chance to create the kind of workplace he'd always dreamed of, a place where talent mattered more than background, where respect was given based on character rather than appearance. I think, he said slowly, his voice gaining strength with each word, that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to find yourself. He signed the contract with steady hands, his signature marking not just the beginning of a new job, but the transformation of his entire life trajectory. The pen felt substantial in his hand, each letter of his name carrying the weight of possibility and responsibility. Ray stood and shook Malik's hand firmly, the gesture sealing more than just a business agreement. There's something else I want you to know. What happened at Patterson's wasn't just about individual prejudice. It was about a culture that had been allowed to fester for years, a system that rewarded the wrong behaviors while punishing the right ones. He reached into his portfolio again and withdrew a thick folder filled with incident reports, customer complaints, and employee grievances. This is everything we have on Patterson's for the past 5 years. Sexual harassment complaints that were ignored, racial discrimination that was covered up, customers being overcharged based on their perceived ability to pay. Your firing was just the latest in a pattern of behavior that should have been addressed years ago. The revelation added another layer to Malik's understanding of what had happened. He hadn't just been fired for helping someone. He'd been fired for threatening a corrupt system that depended on silence and compliance to survive. Reynolds wasn't just a bad manager, Ray continued. He was actively protecting a culture of discrimination and abuse. Your willingness to speak up, to challenge his authority, represented everything that system feared. An employee who wouldn't be intimidated, who wouldn't look the other way, who had the courage to do what was right regardless of consequences. Janet was shaking her head in amazement. All of this because you help a stranger fix his motorcycle. But Ray corrected her gently. No, Mrs. Thompson. All of this because your son has the kind of character that compels him to help strangers, to stand up for what's right, to see humanity in people that others would dismiss. The motorcycle was just a catalyst. The real story is about who Malik is as a person. As Ray prepared to leave, he paused at the door with one final observation. You know, Malik, in all my years in business, I've learned that the most valuable employees aren't the ones who follow orders blindly. They're the ones who have the moral courage to challenge systems that aren't working, who care more about doing what's right than about protecting their own comfort. 6 months later, Malik stood in the gleaming service bay of Henderson Automotive's Queens flagship location, watching his team of 15 technicians work with the kind of collaborative efficiency he'd once only dreamed of. The shop hummed with productive energy, completely free from the toxic undercurrents that had poisoned his experience at Patterson's. The transformation had been remarkable, but not without challenges. When Malik had first arrived as the new regional manager, he'd encountered skepticism from veteran mechanics who questioned whether someone so young could effectively lead them. Some had been openly hostile, testing his authority and undermining his decisions whenever possible. But Malik had learned from his experience at Patterson's. Instead of fighting the resistance, he'd addressed it directly, calling individual meetings with each team member to understand their concerns and explain his vision for the shop. He'd demonstrated his technical expertise by working alongside them on the most challenging repairs, earning their respect through competence rather than demanding it through authority. The results spoke for themselves. Under Malik's leadership, the Queens location had become the highest performing shop in the entire Henderson network, with customer satisfaction scores that consistently exceeded company averages. More importantly, employee retention had improved dramatically, with mechanics actually requesting transfers to work under his supervision. His team was diverse in every sense of the word, different races, different ages, different backgrounds, but united by their shared commitment to excellence and mutual respect. There was Carlos Martinez, a 45-year-old Puerto Rican mechanic who'd been passed over for promotion at 3 previous shops before Malik recognized his diagnostic brilliance and promoted him to lead technician. There was Ashley Chun, a 24-year-old Asian-American woman who'd fought to be taken seriously in a male-dominated industry and had found in Malik a manager who judged performance rather than gender. Most significantly, there was Jerome Williams, the same Jerome who'd been driven out of Patterson's months before Malik's own arrival. Malik had tracked him down and offered him a position as assistant manager, providing the respect and opportunity that had been denied at their former workplace. Jerome had initially been suspicious, wondering if this was some kind of setup, but Malik's sincerity had eventually won him over. You know what's different about this place? Jerome had told him during one of their regular check-ins. People actually listen when you talk. Your ideas matter. Your experience counts for something. I forgot what that felt like. The unconscious bias training program Malik had developed was being rolled out across all 47 Henderson locations, with remarkable results. Workplace complaints had dropped by 70%, while employee retention had improved by nearly 50%. More importantly, the company culture was shifting toward one that valued character over conformity, skill over stereotypes. The training wasn't just about avoiding legal liability. It was about creating genuine understanding. Malik had designed scenarios based on real workplace situations, helping employees recognize their own unconscious biases while providing tools for more inclusive behavior. The sessions were mandatory for all employees, from entry-level technicians to senior management. One of the most powerful components was a reverse mentoring program, where young mechanics and mechanics of color were paired with senior staff to share their perspectives and experiences. The program had created surprising connections, with veteran mechanics gaining new insights into the challenges faced by their younger colleagues. Janet Thompson had been able to cut back to part-time work at the hospital, her arthritis finally getting the rest it needed after years of overuse. The financial pressure that had dominated their lives for decades had lifted, replaced by a security that allowed them to think about the future rather than just surviving each month. She often visited Malik's shop during her breaks, marveling at the transformation in her son from invisible mechanic to confident leader. The difference wasn't just professional. Malik carried himself differently now, with the assurance that came from knowing his work had meaning beyond paycheck. "You know what I'm most proud of?" she told him one afternoon as they watched his team collaborate on a complex engine rebuild. "Not the money or the title or any of that. I'm proud that you stayed true to who you are." The comment struck Malik deeply because it captured something essential about his journey. Success hadn't changed his core values or made him forget where he'd come from. If anything, it had reinforced his commitment to creating opportunities for others who might otherwise be overlooked or underestimated. His office walls were covered with thank you letters from customers, achievement certificates from his team members, and photos from community events where Henderson Automotive had provided free car repairs for low-income families. But the item he treasured most was a simple handwritten note from Maria Santos, the single mother whose Honda he'd quietly repaired at Patterson's. The note had arrived at his new office 3 months after he'd started, forwarded through a chain of connections. Maria had heard about his promotion and wanted him to know that her car was still running perfectly, that her children were doing well in school, and that his kindness had reminded her that there were still good people in the world willing to help others. Ray Henderson remained a regular presence in Malik's life, not as a boss checking up on an employee, but as a mentor guiding a protege. Their shared experience outside Patterson's had forged a bond that transcended typical corporate relationships. Ray had seen Malik's character under pressure, while Malik had learned that true leadership meant having the courage to be authentic regardless of others' expectations. "The best leaders," Ray told him during one of their monthly dinners at a quiet restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, "are the ones who create more leaders. Your job isn't just to manage that shop. It's to identify and develop the next generation of people who will carry these values forward." And that's exactly what Malik did. He made it his mission to find talented mechanics who'd been overlooked by other shops, especially young people of color who reminded him of his own struggles. Under his guidance, they flourished, their skills developing alongside their confidence. One of his proudest achievements was promoting Jamal Rodriguez, a 19-year-old Puerto Rican mechanic who'd been dismissed from 3 other shops for being too aggressive and difficult to manage. Malik recognized that Jamal's intensity wasn't aggression. It was passion being channeled in the wrong direction, frustration at being constantly underestimated and dismissed. With proper mentorship and clear expectations, Jamal became one of the shop's most reliable technicians. More importantly, he became a mentor himself, helping other young mechanics navigate the challenges of establishing themselves in the industry. "Mr. Malik saved my life," Jamal had told a reporter from an industry magazine that was doing a story on Henderson Automotive's innovative management practices. "Not just my career, my life. I was about to give up on this whole thing, maybe get into some bad situations. But he saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself." The ripple effects of that single morning outside Patterson's continued to spread in ways Malik hadn't anticipated. His success story became part of Henderson Automotive's recruiting pitch, helping them attract top talent who wanted to work for a company that valued character over appearances. Young mechanics from across the city sought positions at his shop, knowing they would be judged on their abilities rather than their backgrounds. The training program he developed was adapted by other companies in different industries, creating a network of workplaces committed to genuine inclusion rather than superficial diversity initiatives. Malik found himself speaking at industry conferences, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned about building inclusive workplace cultures. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Malik had discovered that standing up for his principles wasn't a luxury he couldn't afford. It was a necessity he couldn't live without. The courage he'd shown that morning outside Patterson's had become a cornerstone of his identity, informing every decision he made as a leader and as a man. He'd learned that integrity wasn't about being perfect. It was about being consistent. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about taking responsibility when you did. It wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being the person others could count on to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. On quiet Sunday mornings, he sometimes drove past Patterson's auto service on his way to visit his mother. The shop was still there, still operating, but with significantly reduced business and a reputation for poor customer service that had spread through online reviews and word of mouth. The new management had implemented Henderson corporate policies, but changing culture was more difficult than changing procedures. Several of the veteran mechanics had quit rather than adapt to new expectations about workplace respect and customer service. Danny Sullivan had been terminated during the first month of the new management for making inappropriate comments to a female customer. Reynolds had found work at another garage across town, where his management style continued to drive away both customers and quality employees. Malik felt no satisfaction in his former manager's struggles, only sadness for the opportunities wasted and the potential unrealized. Hurt people hurt people, Ray had observed when Malik mentioned seeing Reynolds at a gas station, looking older and more defeated than he remembered. His prejudice and cruelty came from somewhere, probably for being treated the same way himself at some point. That doesn't excuse his behavior, but it helps explain it. The observation had helped Malik understand that his success wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about breaking cycles of discrimination and abuse, about creating positive change that would benefit people he might never meet. As he stood in his shop that day, watching his diverse team work together with mutual respect and shared purpose, Malik reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It had started with a simple choice: to see a human being in distress and offer help without calculating the cost. That choice had cost him everything he thought he wanted and given him everything he never knew he needed. He'd lost a job but found his calling. He'd been fired for insubordination but discovered true leadership. He'd been punished for his principles but ultimately rewarded for his character. The young man who'd once felt invisible had become impossible to ignore, not through loud demands for attention, but through quiet demonstrations of integrity. His success wasn't measured only in dollars and promotions, but in the lives he'd changed and the barriers he'd broken down. Most importantly, Malik had learned that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, but it's always the thing that allows you to sleep peacefully at night. In a world that often rewards compromise and punishes principle, he'd chosen to be the change he wanted to see. And in that choice, he discovered something profound. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to become the person the world expects you to be, and instead insist on being the person you know you are. The garage hummed around him, a testament to what was possible when character triumphed over prejudice, when courage overcame comfort, when one person's willingness to stand up created space for others to rise up. As Malik prepared to lock up the shop that evening, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple but powerful. Saw the article about your shop in the paper. Just wanted to say thank you for showing people like my son that integrity still matters in this world. Keep being the change we need to see. Messages like that arrived regularly now, from parents, from young mechanics starting their careers, from customers who'd experienced the difference that respectful service could make. Each one reminded Malik that his choice that morning had rippled outward in ways he was still discovering. The city lights sparkled around him as he walked to his car, no longer the invisible young man who'd once felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. He was a leader now, a mentor, a living example of what could happen when someone refused to let the world define their worth. And tomorrow, he'd return to his shop, ready to create more opportunities, develop more talent, and continue the work of building a world where character mattered more than color, where skill trumped stereotype, where the content of one's heart weighed more than the assumptions others might make. It was good work. It was necessary work. And for Malik Thompson, it was the work of a lifetime, A lifetime that had been fundamentally changed by choosing compassion over convenience on a cold Tuesday morning in Manhattan. In the end, that's all it takes. A moment of courage, a choice to see humanity in others, a willingness to pay the price for standing up for what's right. The ripples from such moments can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities, entire industries, entire ways of thinking about what's possible when people choose connection over division. Malik Thompson had learned that lesson the hard way, and now he was spending his life teaching it to others. One mechanic at a time, one shop at a time, one choice at a time. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power we all have to make a difference, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from our incredible community of viewers who believe, like Malik, that doing the right thing is always worth it, no matter the cost. Your support helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Thank you for watching, and remember, you never know when your moment to make a difference will come. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to help a stranger, to stand up for what's right, and to refuse to let prejudice win. Be the person who sees humanity in others, because you never know, that person might just be the CEO in disguise, waiting to reward character over compromise. See you in the next video.